So hi everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which each of us is zooming in from today. I sit on the traditional lands of Dharawal country and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I have with me today Brenna Artinger, who's an independent Buddhist scholar and whose research focuses on exclusion and extremism.
Hi, everyone. Awesome to be with you today. My name is Brenna Artinger, and I am on the lands of the Wabanaki Confederacy of Peoples. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Awesome, welcome. And I've got Anne Gleig, who's an Associate Professor of Religion and Cultural Studies at the University of Central Florida.
So yeah, hi everyone. I'm also really excited to be in conversation tonight, and I'm speaking from Orlando and the traditional territories of the Miccosukee and Seminole people.
Welcome, Anne. And I have Bhante Sujato, who's an Australian Buddhist monk and a translator of Pali texts.
Hi, everyone. And I'm here in Harris Park in Western Sydney. And I am very happy to be on the land of the Barramadigal people of the Darug Nation, who have been the custodians of this land for many thousands of years and have never ceded it. So, gratitude to all of the Barramadigal people for looking after this land and taking care of it.
Thank you. Welcome, Bhante. So we've been having a conversation as a group for a few months about some of the concerning trends we've seen in contemporary Buddhism recently, particularly around toxic masculinity. And today we're discussing what toxic masculinity is, how it's been manifesting in Buddhism, and the ways in which we can counter it when we see it. So we're thinking a lot about different forms of masculinity in Buddhism. And I wanted to get a little bit of a broader context. I wanted to ask in particular, Anne, how you see masculinity and masculine rhetoric play out in contemporary Buddhism.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's a really important one because I think that toxic masculinity, often people will, just think of the most extreme versions. But I think it's really important to be aware that there's really a spectrum of what I actually would call reactionary masculinities in contemporary Buddhism. And, as the term suggests, they're essentially based in a reaction to some form of either social justice, particularly feminism. So we see a lot of male backlash against feminism in contemporary Buddhism, and I would chart that backlash as happening right across the scale, from the more extreme alt-right Buddhists that Brenna will talk about in some detail, to the more moderate Buddhists who claim to be apolitical. Brenna and I call them reactionary centrists in our article on the Buddhist culture wars. And I would say even in progressive Buddhist spaces, which is, quite depressing, that you do, find often, these forms of reactionary, masculinity. And I know that Aya Yeshe is a kind of friend, friend of yours, of the progressive, Australian Buddhists. And, Aya Yeshe is someone that I follow on Facebook, and I've been in a couple of, several Facebook Buddhist groups with her, and she is very outspoken against gender violence and gender inequalities in contemporary Buddhism. And I've been really alarmed at the type of reactions that she is being subject to, even in progressive Buddhist groups, and essentially this has taken the form of personal attacks, gaslighting, and just a delegitimation of feminist concerns as not Buddhist. In our article, we look at the Zen teacher Brad Warner as an example of a kind of, reactionary centrist, as someone who tends to dismiss, for example, transgender Buddhists, has really dismissed, forms of racial justice in Buddhism. So there's very diffuse, you know, there's few forms of, I would say, reactionary masculinity. Another form that reactionary masculinity takes in contemporary Buddhism is quite interesting. It's really around a gendering of meditation. So in my book, American Dharma, which I, you know, published a few years ago, I have a chapter on meditation, and I basically identified two forms, two lineages of meditation in, you know, the American Insight tradition. And one of them I call the relational lineage. And one of the founders, you know, of the relational lineage is Jack Kornfield of, you know, Spirit Rock Meditation Society. And he basically, you know, he basically advances an approach to meditation, which he describes as a kind of more feminine approach to practice, a more embodied, a more relational way to practice meditation. And he aligns this approach with Ajahn Chah of the Thai forest tradition. So I'm kind of interested to hear what, you know, Bhante has to say about this. But he also contrasts it with the Burmese lineage of U Pandita. And he says, look, U Pandita uses all of these really heavily masculine, you know, descriptions of meditation, like you have to, you know, conquer, you know, the afflictions, and you have to be a warrior. And so Jack Kornfield saying, look, no, we want to take a more feminine approach. Now, reacting to Jack Kornfield is a pragmatic Dharma movement, and they explicitly position themselves as a kind of return to the more masculine Burmese lineage. And they use also really masculine gendered images of meditation. You know, they use the samurai warrior, and they talk about conquering, and they, you know, really explicitly embrace a masculine approach. So it's just kind of interesting to me as a, you know, it's interesting to me as a researcher to kind of track these different forms of, like, what I call reactionary, you know, masculine rhetoric.
And what about you, Bhante? How do you see masculinity play out in contemporary Buddhism?
Well, I mean, for a start, I mean, just so that we're clear, I don't really know anything about it, kind of American Buddhism and a lot of the spaces that you're talking about. So that's not my world. But in my sort of life as a monk, obviously you're in male-dominated spaces, and I mean, look, I would say that the foundation of what we're trying to do, and what the Buddha was trying to do, was a kind of a balanced or a healthy masculinity, and, you know, talking about like the use of that hyper masculine language, like warriors and all of this kind of stuff. For John Power, the Australian academic, or I think Australian American academic, did a book called A Bull of a Man some years ago, and he pointed out that the Buddha was described with this very masculinist imagery, which is true, but the Buddha is also described and uses what would be traditionally configured as very feminine imagery and very feminine approaches as well. And so if you look at these things, then there is a balance. There is a tendency within monastic communities to attract and harbour men who have problems with women, and, you know, that's hardly a great surprise. Now, in some cases, that's not necessarily even particularly unhealthy. Sometimes maybe there are, you know, guys who are confused or whatever, and they find refuge in the Sangha, and they can sort of get on with their life without having to face up to their sexuality or something like that, and it can be a bit of a refuge for them. And maybe they can grow. But in some cases, people really get stuck, and there's an underlying misogyny to a lot of the way that people think and people act, and I think the crisis, the crux in it, was the refusal of the bhikkhuni ordination, at least in my tradition. And once you've done that, you've immediately said, women will never be my equal. I will never look at women as my sisters. I will never think of women as friends and colleagues and equals. They will only ever be subject, and they will always be excluded. And most crucially, they will never control the real estate. We own the real estate. That's the crucial thing. That's how you keep the power.
Yes, we've seen that across a lot of different populations and cultures.
Yeah.
Sense of using property to control. So thank you for that. And I wondered now if we could think about the crux of what we're talking about, which is this notion of toxic masculinity. Brenna, would you like to say a little bit about what that is exactly, in case people, aren't across the term?
Yeah, and I think just to give a little bit of a kind of broad definition, I think we see toxic masculinity as a kind of masculinity that is in some way inherently harmful to both men themselves, but also to everyone who is kind of caught up in that masculinity as well. And we'll go into a little bit more detail in just a little bit later, kind of what that looks like. But I think it is really it's a kind of hyper masculinizing of certain ideas, of certain spaces that is creating some kind of harm to the people who are engaging in those spaces.
Yeah. Can I just add something to that? So I actually did a little kind of genealogical search of the term toxic masculinity, which is a very academic thing to do. And I was actually quite surprised to find that it only really started to become popular around 2015. And so it kind of emerges from like a host of terms such as, macho, machismo, bro culture, hegemonic masculinity, which is very academic, a bit of a mouthful, dominant masculinity. It's a term, one of many terms that really seeks to identify a certain form of male conditioning and behavior. And also, quite interestingly, in the last 8 years, there's been several scientific studies on toxic masculinity. And actually in 2019, the American Psychological Association released a study that basically showed that toxic masculinity, which it defined as violent, dominant, has repressing emotions and kind of maintaining an appearance of hardness and impenetrability, and based on a hierarchy over and above femininity, was actually a major cause of harm for men, as Brenna said. And of course, that's not to mention the violence it inflicts on other populations, women, non-binary folk, transgender folk. So it's both a colloquial term and also, is being used officially as a psychological term, which I think is really important to note.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also important to note that we're talking about masculinities and a hierarchy of masculinities rather than one static thing. So
yeah.
Thanks for that, Anne. Okay, so I'd like to know how each of you have seen this manifested in Buddhist communities recently. So Bhante, you mentioned a little bit about monastics and how this might express itself in those types of contexts. Do you have anything more to add on it?
Well, look, a small example came by just the other day, and it's not a really kind of serious thing, but I think it was really kind of indicative. There was on Hacker News, where hackers go to get their news, and one monk had made a open Buddhist university, which was a good website resource for Buddhism and so on. And another monk comes on and criticizes him for calling it a university. And the way that he did that, it was like, oh, I'm just a junior monk, but he's even more junior than me. But he's then pretending to be running a university and calling himself dean of the university, which he wasn't. And all this kind of thing. But then more senior monks would be like this, and they would be snarking at him. And if the more senior monks saw him, they would be putting him down for doing this. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, this is literally how trauma gets passed down through generations. He's internalized what he thinks a senior monk should be behaving. And this whole thing around status anxiety of who's senior and who's junior is just like you're just conditioned in that way. And again, within the Western monastic order, and we have to, I think, really distinguish between the Western monastic order and the Asian monastic order. In the Asian monastic order, being a monk or a nun is more normal. And so it tends to attract more normal people. In the Western monastic communities, is very unnormal and tends to attract people who do not have a sort of normal psychological profile. And a lot of people suffer from this kind of status anxiety. A lot of people come from this very kind of hating of Western culture, of your own culture, and projecting on Orientalist culture and these kinds of things, and also like looking for defined patriarchal father figures and only finding safety in that kind of thing. And so you find these kinds of communities draw these kinds of things. And we've seen this kind of play out in ways that are, you know, relatively minor like that. And then at the more extreme levels, we've seen, you know, people like Bhante Punadamo, who's been hanging around with Nazis. And, you know, we've heard of like things like, say, there'll be an undercurrent within the monastery where they are the sort of the dark what, I guess, is instead of the dark web is the dark what, where they're handing around Jordan Peterson talks and things like that, and sort of indulging in or getting caught up in these same webs of this kind of incel culture that we're talking about. And, you know, it's not certainly not something that those people in monasteries are unaware of. Yeah, but it may be not expressed openly.
Yeah, okay. And Anne, I know that you've done a lot of work thinking about online spaces and how this is manifested in Buddhist communities that are more online. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I actually also really wanted to, is it okay if I ask Brenna to talk on that? Because I actually, as Bhante was talking, I really was thinking about the impact, I've seen in my research, the current research I'm doing with Amy Langenberg on sexual abuse in Buddhism, across kind of lineages and transnational Buddhism.
Right.
And, I'd say that toxic masculinity, is really so harmful in those cases. I mean, one expression of it is the abuse itself. Male entitlement, one characteristic of toxic masculinity is a sense of entitlement to sex with women. That women are generally seen as, objects, as property of men. And so in the actual abuse itself, you have this sense of, the abusive teachers have ownership, over their, female, sometimes male students. We're mostly working with female survivors. But then you also have the toxic masculinity show up in the ways in which, when survivors of abuse try and talk out, or even supporters for survivors, they are really also met with tremendous rage, with gaslighting, really, just, things that have really shook me to the core of, how can you be Buddhist and, talk to people like this? So really violent, behavior towards abuse victims. And, actually the survivors have reported to us that the response that they've received has actually been as harmful as the abuse, So I think toxic masculinity really does show up a lot in the sexual abuse cases. And then the online stuff, there's so much. Brenna, are you okay to pick up some?
Yeah. And I think too, we see this in a little bit in right-wing Buddhist communities, but especially in alt-right Buddhist communities as well. And there's this idea of this kind of Chad trad, as they call it, this really kind of hyper-masculine individual who is, fluent in Pali and who has all of this characteristics of this kind of ideal Buddhist man. And I think this ties in a little bit as well to kind of that kind of incel community. This there was a Reddit community that existed called RPUA, Pickup Artists, which gave information on how to pick up women and how to really kind of, I'm not sure if it's improving yourself, but to really be this kind of ideal masculinized version. And so we see this especially in alt-right communities in terms of their kind of embodying of, and maybe Bhante can talk about this later as well, this idealized version of kind of the Buddha as this really masculine, authoritative figure. And there's one community that we would see this a lot in called right-wing Dharma squads, which no longer create episodes of their podcast, but would really kind of dive deeper into these images of masculinity and of, in many ways, that kind of masculinity kind of acting as the justification for violence against various different kinds of people.
Very alarming. And I just wanted to acknowledge that we are talking from a certain position. We're talking from the perspective of being very immersed in Buddhism in the West, but toxic masculinity and patriarchal norms exist everywhere in the world. And I know that our friend Yeshi, who you'll hear from in the next panel, has done a lot of work in various other countries, Orthodox Buddhist communities. And she points to the fact that there's a lack of access to teachings on enlightenment in some of these communities. A lot of female practitioners feel shame about their bodies and they pray to be reborn as men. Women are more likely to disrobe than men. Some of them face starvation, imprisonment, and experience a lot of discrimination and very poor material conditions because of their gender. So just acknowledging that toxic masculinity is something that exists cross-culturally and something that is certainly not limited to one country.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just speak to that very briefly, Nadine, I agree with everything Yeshi says. I think the important thing is to remember that the manner in which it manifests is different in different cultures. So that's, and the point I was making earlier was that within traditional Buddhist cultures, it manifests through established institutions. It's kind of normalized. And I think what we're seeing in the West was that there was a kind of, I guess, an assumption that if you're going to be Buddhist, you're going to be progressive. And that's where we're seeing a sort of a shift in that. So I think there's a different sort of cultural dynamic, but obviously in terms of the experience of it, then there's a lot that's in common as well. Yeah.
Indeed. Okay, so Bhante, this leads me to my next question. So I know that Anne and Brenna have done quite a bit of work looking at American Buddhism in particular. And so they've written some articles, and we've also got that amazing resource on American Buddhism, the book that Anne produced. And some of the things that Anne talked about in that book are reflective of what's happening in Australia as well. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more to whether you think these trends on the internet and beyond affect other places in a significant way, like America, basically.
Do they affect other places? Sure. Of course, yeah, affect everywhere. I mean, look, I think the roots of this thing, to me, I always think is a developmental disorder. You know, it's a failure for boys to grow up. And this is the kind of the root of all of these kind of really toxic behaviors. So yeah, that affects people all around the world. It affects people in ways that are sometimes different, sometimes the same. America obviously has an outsized cultural imprint and an effect on the rest of the world. But at the same time, other nations also, like it's not, how do I put this? It's pretty common among Buddhist cultures to be anti-American, at least in theory, right? And to be anti-Western, at least in theory. I mean, they're like getting their smartphones and they like all the kind of toys that the West can offer, but at the same time, they want to retain their sort of cultural identity and their sort of sense of integrity. And so there are other factors that are going on in Thailand with the military and so on, in Myanmar also with the military resurgence, in Sri Lanka with the struggles to maintain a coherent functioning country and so on. So all of these have their own individual struggles. And these issues play out in different ways in these different places. Obviously, again, obviously many experiences in common, but the cultural dynamics are quite can be quite specific.
Can I just add one? Is it okay if I add something? So, I think it's really interesting because especially the more extreme Buddhists that we tracked in our article, we tracked 3 categories: reactionary centrists, who generally present themselves as moderate or even liberal. A second category was right-wing Buddhists who, are more kind of traditionally right-wing. And then third were the alt-right. But it was interesting because both the alt-right and the right-wing Buddhists, they really like to align themselves with traditional Buddhism. Like they really like to align themselves with the, you know, Asian Orthodox Buddhists. And, you know, essentially they were like, look, Asian Orthodox Buddhists are patriarchal. Like they know that women are inferior. And so we're actually closer to real Buddhism than the progressive Buddhists, you know? So there was this alignment made, but, you know, like a kind of global patriarchy. So, you know, that's something really important to see. I think it's also important to note that even though there is, you know, this idea, you know, that Western Buddhism, like the Insight community, for example, is super progressive, it isn't actually always the reality on the ground. So even in the Insight tradition, you know, women had to do a lot to get equal representation and to kind of occupy, you know, teaching positions of authority. So, you know, I think that, you know, patriarchy, it can't be contained in these binaries of the traditional versus the modern, or the Asian versus the Western. You know, it kind of manifests. It's global, but it manifests local. So I think we just need to look in specific contexts and really pull out these toxic threads, you know, which I guess is kind of what we're, you know, doing exactly in this conversation.
Yeah.
It's humbling though to see the scale of, you know, toxic masculinity, you know, and reactionary masculinity. It's kind of humbling and a bit depressing, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know that you've all thought a lot about right-wing Buddhists, which sound a little bit counterintuitive, but in any event, they exist. And Brenna, I thought you could tell us a little bit more about extreme right-wing Buddhists, or the alt-right.
Yeah, and we touched on this a little bit already, but I think that kind of the way that I think most importantly that they're linked is that I could be wrong on this, and I think there needs to be more research on this as well, but I think a lot of people who we see as alt-right Buddhists are starting from this really place of toxic masculinity, and that's how they kind of get into these spheres of, especially the alt-right spaces online, and really kind of being, in some sense, kind of indoctrinated into alt-right views. And so I think it really starts from this place of toxic masculinity that allows them to be able to kind of build upon these extremist views. And that's, I kind of think, where we might need to figure out more information as well, as how kind of when Buddhism comes in, if it was already there or if it comes in at a later time. But that's really how we see these two kind of areas merge in some sense, is finding these extremist views, and then also recognizing the views in, or the ideas within Buddhism that are supportive of really toxic masculine ideas, and ideas that are justifying both the alt-right and Buddhist worldviews in some sense.
That's absolutely troubling and fascinating as well. And I wondered, Bhante, if you would like to talk a little bit more to how you've seen right-wing Buddhists co-opt Buddhist teachings for their own purposes.
Yeah, that is, I mean, it's an interesting point, you know, is to what extent people are sort of drawn. There's in the Dhatu Samyutta, the Buddha said that people of an element are drawn to each other. And he said, see the people there with all the monks with Sariputta, they're all very wise. You see all the ones with Mahamoggallana, they all have great psychic powers. You see all the ones with Devadatta? Yeah. And so there's definitely an element of that. And I think like there's, like I said, I always see these things in terms of developmental disorder. And I think that the structures of culture are intended to get messy, violent, testosterone-fueled teenage boys and grow them into healthy adults. And all, you know, sports and marriage and initiation ceremonies and education and the hero's journey and all of these kinds of things are ways of trying to get boys to grow in and to become men. And it often doesn't work. and it breaks down. And then you have these men who have all of these insecurities and all of these mummy issues and all of this, you know, all of this kind of stuff. Are they drawn to Buddhism for that? Sure, you know. And are they, you know, what's a kind of a response to it? Hard to say, yeah, not easy, but at least if we can identify the problem, then there's a start. I think, you know, I think it's you're drawn into it and then it's amplified. So I think it's both. I think but it would be interesting to, like Brenna said, to get some more empirical data on that.
Yeah, and I think that Buddhism does represent a hero journey for many of the men that we're talking about. And so a lot of that kind of aggressiveness and that sense of individualism that's been mentioned already, that underpins toxic masculinity and competition, is somehow captured in the Buddhist path for some of these individuals.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I know that a lot of these ideas are given free rein on the internet, and that these types of conversations and movements are happening online. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the internet and how that plays a part.
Sorry, who's this one for?
So maybe start with you, Bhante.
All right, I feel like I'm speaking a lot, but anyway. Yeah, so obviously, I mean, in a sense, like, you know, not to how do I put this? Not to say the wrong thing, but I think we're all probably of a generation that thinks of the internet as being a thing over there rather than being just like ambient and just being like where everything is. And there's been that recent research was very striking, showing a major mental health crisis in girls starting in 2012 with the advent of the smartphone. And that's kind of really distressing and very a potent measure of how these things influence us, especially when that's like the first generation of kids who are brought up with the internet just like everywhere all the time, rather than being a place that you go to. There's a theory by, I just read recently by, what's her name, Maggie Appleton, which is, I think, really interesting. And she talks about the way that, like those experiences that you mentioned with Ayesha getting bullied in the Facebook group as a classic example, where you have the kind of what you think of the normal web, which Maggie Appleton calls, what does she call, the dark forest of the clear web. And there we really failed to fulfill the promise of what that had to offer, to create communities and to facilitate conversation. And Cory Doctorow calls it the enshittification of the web, that there's this inevitable process that once it reaches a certain scale that it's just going to get worse and worse. And so we retreat into what Maggie Appleton calls the cozy web, which is where you have sort of more kind of limited communities. And so this might be a Slack channel or a Discord, it might be a discourse forum or something like that, where you can keep people out and have a little corner where you're no longer thinking I'm communicating with everybody, but where you just have your little corner, which is, you know, that's what I've done. Like I don't go out, I mean, I did this years ago, I don't go out into Facebook and Twitter and things like that because I can't stand it. But you know, when we do that, of course, everybody else is doing that as well. And so a lot of these conversations about these extremism is happening on Discord channels, Telegram channels, and these kinds of things where they can't readily be monitored. So this then becomes a question about how do we approach it? You know, what is how do we deal with this internet which we've created?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is it okay if I just bounce off?
Please,
that?
yeah.
So, you know, it's kind of interesting because you kind of evoked the promise of the internet,
right.
And that kind of reminded me of fourth wave feminism. You know, often scholars break, you know, the history of feminism into different waves,
right.
And you know, fourth wave feminism was quite enthusiastic about the internet. You know, it was the sense that the internet could be this kind of place of resistance, you know, and some like successful campaigns that we've seen on the internet. So I think, you know, there is still ways in which the internet works for feminism. You know, Me Too movement, for example, the hashtag Me Too, a big one. Say Her Name for, protesting the violence and murders of Black women is another example. But of course, the internet is also a place of terror for women on so many levels. Revenge porn, for example, is something that comes to mind. So many, there has been so many studies done on the impact on teenage girls of, these like photographs and videos being shared online, and just really horrific stories, suicides and things like that. And then in terms of like the Buddhist world, Brenna and I's article, The Buddhist Culture Wars, which is open access, we might be able to link to the episode. We really drew on the work of Angela Nagel, and she wrote a book called Kill All Normies. And she basically looks at internet culture, right-wing and left-wing internet culture. And I think really what she shows is the ways in which, which Brenna's also talked about, in which populations are, these kind of colliding worlds that wouldn't normally, necessarily come together, but on the internet, everything kind of, presses into each other. And so you really are seeing this radicalization of young men. And often, the forums around, like how to pick up women, incel culture, we saw a lot of overlap between those forums and alt-right Buddhists, So that's really disturbing. And again, it's a range. You've got your moderate Facebook groups, where I often, see bullying of women. I often get into fights with, I'm quite, I'm a bit of a scrapper. So I will speak up, but I see a lot of women, just really get bullied off these groups. And it's quite disturbing to see the bullying, but it's also disturbing to see the bystanding. It's like all the other Buddhists who aren't speaking up, who are seeing these, there'll be a few aggressive men. Sometimes they're the moderators of these, groups, and they'll go after a woman. And I'm like waiting for someone to speak up. And often, occasionally someone will, but often they don't. So it is quite alarming, actually, what's, how the internet is. It's just the Buddhist world is a microcosm of the macrocosm of the internet, basically, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what we all see.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Brenna, did you want to add a little bit more to that?
Yeah, I think just to build off that a little bit, I think we really see these kinds of trends also in what's called the intellectual dark web, which is not necessarily a space, but which is the idea of people who are kind of refuting like things like cancel culture, who are talking about identity politics, and really kind of creating these spaces that are really kind of right-wing attitudes and right-wing ideas, where they really get kind of profligated in some sense, and repeated continuously. And then I think also including the ideas of people who are refuting kind of the DEI efforts. And we see this especially in kind of what builds off of that, which is ideas around anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And there was actually a really good article in the New York Times today about an organization that was created in order to track instances, especially online, of anti-Semitism, and really kind of going deep into those spaces online where people are posting threatening comments and ideas and those kinds of things, and tracking to ensure that they don't become acts of violence against Jews across mostly the U.S. in the case of this article. And so I think these online spaces are really supporting and really kind of, when we talk about toxic masculinity in terms of Buddhism, really encouraging these ideas and really encouraging people to talk about different violent ideas that they have against certain communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And is it true that you wouldn't necessarily see this down at your local Buddhist centre, that somehow the platform has enabled these voices to come forward and become stronger in a way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think while we do see some instances in kind of community spaces, and I think as Bhante Sujato mentioned, Ajahn Punadamo, who is in Canada, that's an example of someone who is fairly senior within the Thai forest tradition, we are seeing interact with people of alt-right Buddhist ideas. And that's something that we haven't really seen to this extent very often. So it's starting to come a little bit more into more public spaces, but definitely it exists very strongly online.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, it's okay to say it, Brenna. They're Nazis.
Can I
say
just
their name?
Can I add something? It's quite interesting because Amy Langenberg and I, doing this project on sexual abuse that I referred to earlier, and we were looking at articles, the first articles in Tricycle and Lion's Roar, Buddhist magazines about sexual abuse. And it's really like, they're in the 1980s, the first wave of articles, right? And the comment threads to the articles, letter to the editor type of thing. It's like, it's quite interesting because some of the comments are also like what we now find online. There's comments like, these women hate men. Like, this is a campaign to destroy, male Buddhists. It's a female hysteria. One comment, this woman, June Campbell, had spoken out about, the abuse that, being a secret consort of Kalu Rinpoche and how she felt this was an abusive relationship. And, one person, Lee, someone from Utah, had written and said, June Campbell should be spanked for daring to talk about the great Kalu Rinpoche like this. And it's just incredible that someone actually sat down and wrote a letter like that and then put a stamp on it and sent it to Tricycle, and then Tricycle printed it. But it's really also interesting historically because it shows this lineage of misogyny in these so-called progressive communities. Now, I think that does show up in Buddhist communities, but it probably shows up in a less, visible way. But there will be people like Lee, who possibly has a position of authority in his Sangha, who might have something to say about who gets invited to speak in the Sangha. So I think that we can't necessarily assume that it's only online activity. So that's a really interesting project that, really needs to be pursued. Like, how does this translate to policies on the ground,
Yes, exactly. And some of those unspoken decisions that you're referring to, we don't have context for until we understand what people really believe and what they really think about these social issues.
Yeah, I will say that one board that we interviewed in a Buddhist community, a board member it was a community that was investigating a teacher of sexual abuse, and a board member we interviewed said that she'd resigned from the board because of the threatening comments and disparaging comments that she'd read online. Like, it really impacted her, they were questioning how dare the board investigate. It was Noah Levine actually of Against the Stream. And so it does impact people, so I think that's important to note, that sometimes people can be dismissive of it's just the internet, as if it doesn't have real life consequences, but it does have real life consequences.
Absolutely. These are views and beliefs that humans hold. Doesn't really matter which platform they're being communicated through, they're still harmful. So thanks for reiterating that, Anne. Okay, look, this has been a little bit negative. We've talked about all the problems, and sometimes I think backlash is actually a really good indication that we're making a lot of progress in terms of equality and justice in the communities, because obviously we're impacting individuals so much so that they feel they need to create their own YouTube channels in response and speak out. So in some ways, some of these responses can be seen as backlash, I think. And then in other ways, they can be seen as trends that we should be looking out for and responding to. And I think, Anne, you raised that really good point that a lot of people online are just bystanders. They don't know what to do, they feel confused, or they feel like it's not their place, or they don't have the language really to respond to what they're seeing. So I wondered if you had some words of advice to those who would like to effectively respond to what we've talked about today. So Might start with you, Bhante, because I know you've got some views on deplatforming as a strategy.
I have views on many things, man. Oh, so many things. But yes, look, in terms of how we're going to respond on the internet, I think number one, most of the internet is made by mad people, and we have to just stop and just remember that. 99% of all of the posts on social media and all of these kinds of things are made by people who are not emotionally and psychologically healthy. And look, I'm just making figures up out of my head here, but it's something like that. And most people don't spend all of their life, most of the people I know hardly ever post on social media. And yet somehow there are thousands of people posting on social media all the time. Not everyone obviously is unhealthy who's doing that, but a lot of people are. And within Buddhism, especially Western Buddhism, has been configured as a response to mental illness and mental distress. And so it attracts people who have all these kinds of emotional and psychological distress, and it offers them a solution. And all too often, people grasp the tail, grasp the wrong side of the Dhamma instead of grasping what they should do. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that if we understand that in that way, then there's a limit to how much discussing and rational discourse is actually going to be helpful. And in my experience, it almost never is, because if you really want to, on the internet, if you really want to change someone, you have to be in a room with them, you have to live with them and grow with them. And even then, I mean, think of all of these like kids who are posting all of these horrifying things on the web, they all have mums. And in most cases, their mums have tried their best to bring up decent young boys, I mean, we can't, as just a person on the internet, just kind of fix this. So to my mind, the most effective things that we can do, we can deplatform, and people should be this kind of speech should be just not tolerated and just kick them off. And as Brenna would know, her role as moderator on our discourse forum, then this was always my policy from the beginning of the forum. And the moderators were always, let's try to reason with them, let's try to talk with them. And I'm not a moderator, so I don't tell moderators what to do. But if they come to me, my advice is always just kick them off. It's okay. It's okay to just say, you can't use this corner of the internet. And hopefully, if they get told that a bunch of times, they might start to get the message. So this is one thing. I think deplatforming is really important, and it needs to happen at a major scale and through all of these social media platforms. But which then speaks to the second thing, which I think is really important, which is regulation. We need to regulate social media in much more strongly. It's been an utter failure of regulation, mainly because the government has been consumed by this idea that government doesn't work, and we can trust these visionaries who are going to create a better future for us. But those visionaries, it turns out, are largely assholes, and they're not going to create a better future. They're going to create a hostile landscape of fire and death. And so let's basically not. So we have to regulate. Regulation is slow and clumsy and all of these things, but unfortunately, it's been made necessary. And so what we're seeing now is that the internet is in fact being highly effectively regulated, very highly effectively regulated by all of the authoritarian regimes who are saying exactly what people can see and what they can't see. And when they give a request to Elon Musk, he gladly complies without a second thought. So yes, the internet is being regulated. It's being regulated by the wrong people. So there needs to be a proactive movement towards a healthy and strong regulation of the internet. Otherwise, everybody's going to retreat into these cozy spaces, and our capacity to have a more open dialogue will continue to erode.
Yeah, it's okay, Brenna, if I go next. Sorry, I'm talking a lot as well. So I wholeheartedly agree with Bhante. I think we do need to, I think most of us have actually moved beyond this naivete of, the power of, reasonable conversation. I've been engaging in conversation, dialogue and fights for over a decade online. And I can't really honestly think of one instance where I really, a success story that I can tell you I changed someone's mind online. So I agree. I think the only thing that I would add is often when I argue against someone on the internet, I'm not doing it with the idea that I'm going to change that person. I'm doing it to be visible to people who that person is attacking. Yeah. You know, so when I think of bystanders, you know, I'd mentioned earlier, that's more what I think. It's like, you're never going to change the, you know, aggressor's mind. But you can make the victim, you know, feel more supported. And I recently finished a book called Say My Name by Chanel Miller. She was sexually assaulted by Brooke Turner. It was a big case, a big sexual assault case. And it was really moving, her book, because she described, you know, that she was anonymous for a long while, and she would read reports of, you know, her, you know, assault. And then she would read the comment threads, and she'd describe, like, you know, she couldn't stop reading them. You know, she knew that she shouldn't, but she couldn't stop reading them. And, you know, she described how painful, you know, the nasty comments were, and how she was a little bit lifted when someone, you know, supported her. And that actually really, that made me feel better about all the time I've wasted on the internet, you know. So I do think being visible in support, you know, calling out toxic masculinity, but without expectation of changing that person, but more as a signal that this is not okay. I see this is not okay, you know, because a lot of people don't feel, you know, able to speak out, you know. So that's one thing. Another thing is, I think that's really important as a more hopeful thing is, I think it's really important to show that traditional Buddhism is not just all about dominant masculinities, because there's a way that contemporary toxic masculine Buddhists really try and bank on the traditional as, you know, they're, you know, portraying the real, you know, the real tradition, and they've got the power of the tradition behind them. So I think we really have to explode any kind of monolithic idea of the tradition and really look at the different models of masculinity. And I know that's something you're doing, you know, Bhante, and I'm really, you know, I'm really grateful that you're doing that, and, you know, for others that are doing that work of multiplicity in the traditional. And then finally, you know, just as with like white awake groups, you know, like as a white person, you know, it's my responsibility to try and, you know, understand how I've been conditioned as a white person and like be free of that conditioning. You know, I really want Buddhist men. There's loads of great Buddhist men. I've got some fantastic, you know, friends, people, men I admire. Like, do the work, you know, do the work of identifying toxic masculinity in yourself and others. You know, there's no point me as a feminist, you know, ragging on about it. Like, men, you know, a lot of men don't listen to women. So you have a responsibility, Buddhist men who are listening to this, you know, please step up and do the work. And I did want to just say that Lama Rod Owens and Greg Snyder of the Brooklyn Zen Center, you know, had started doing this work. They've got a workshop called Undoing Patriarchy and Unveiling the Sacred Masculine. So I would really want to lift up all the attempts by Buddhist men to free themselves and others from toxic masculinity. Thanks for the time, extra time on that, Brenna, sorry.
No, I mean, I think that's, I don't want to be the one to end, so people could jump in as well. But yeah, no, I think, and just to your point as well, that just came to mind was, I think a lot of people will use different, especially the sutras, the different textual sources to be like, this is the kind of monolithic example of Buddhism. So I think as well, really refuting that and really having a voice in bringing examples and bringing even people, you know, not textual sources, but people who are doing good work around really kind of having healthy versions of masculinity and really kind of presenting a Buddhism that is not embodying this toxic masculinity. I think kind of lifting up those examples as well is really important.
Indeed. Well, we've come to the end of our time together, and I just want to thank each of you for your contributions. This has been such an illuminating session, and I'm hoping that we can continue the discussion going forward. So thank you all, and I'll look forward to hearing the next panel.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Nadine, Brenna,
Thank you, Nadine.